So, imagine you are an explorer, right? You are hacking your way through this incredibly dense jungle.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Yeah, and you suddenly stumble upon the ruins of a massive ancient city.
Oh, wow.
Right, so you clear away the vines, you walk into what looks like a town square, and you find all these stone tables. And scattered across them is this totally random assortment of game
Like
pieces.
just a mess of different games.
Exactly. You pick up a beautifully carved wooden knight from a chess set, and right next to it, partially buried in the dirt, is a pair of six-sided dice.
Hmm.
A little further down, you find a stack of brightly colored paper money from Monopoly. And then scattered around the edges are, I don't know, a few wooden Scrabble tiles.
So none of it belongs together.
None of it. Now imagine trying to sit down with a group of people and play a cohesive, functional game using all of those pieces at once.
Oh, man. That would be a nightmare.
Right. You roll the dice, you move the chess knight 3 spaces diagonally, and then you slam your hand on the table demanding $200 in Monopoly money.
Why? Because you rolled a 6.
No, because you claim you landed on a double-letter score. It is absolute chaos.
Yeah. I mean, nobody knows the rules because there is no single rule book.
Exactly. Everybody is angry, everyone feels cheated, and the game inevitably ends in just a bitter shouting match.
It is basically the perfect recipe for total systemic breakdown. You have a table full of people holding pieces of entirely different games.
Yeah.
But they are all aggressively insisting that they are playing the exact same one.
And that ruined game board, that is exactly what it feels like to engage in a moral debate today.
It really is.
Why does our language of right and wrong feel so fundamentally broken? I mean, why does every public discourse, from social media threads to televised political debates or even just Thanksgiving dinner with your extended family, why does it always seem to end in an unresolvable shouting match?
Where no one's mind has ever changed, right?
Right. So to figure that out, we are looking really closely at the work of philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre, specifically his groundbreaking book, After Virtue.
It is such a phenomenal book.
It really is. We are using MacIntyre as our primary diagnostic tool for this deep dive to understand the disease. But we are also bringing in some heavy hitters to explore the cure.
Yeah, we have some great source material today.
We do. We've got classical theology from Thomas Aquinas. We've got insights on the human conscience from Cormac Burke. And we are looking at the massive societal clashes defined by modern political thinkers like John Rawls and Robert Nozick.
It is a really fascinating stack of sources because it doesn't just complain about the state of the world, It meticulously reverse engineers how we actually got here.
Right. It breaks down the mechanics.
Exactly. It breaks down the mechanics of our moral language.
But before we dive into that reverse engineering, we really need to set a hard boundary for you, the listener.
Yes, this is super important.
The sources we are exploring today touch on some of the most intense politically and morally charged debates of our time.
Very intense.
We are going to be dissecting arguments surrounding abortion, nuclear war, capitalism, wealth redistribution, and human rights.
And we are not here to tell you who is right or who is wrong in those specific, highly volatile debates.
Exactly. We are not taking any sides. We aren't endorsing a left-wing perspective or a right-wing perspective.
Not at all.
Our only goal today is to impartially map out the underlying mechanics of these arguments, exactly as they are presented in the source material.
We want to show you the blueprints of these debates so you can understand structurally why they fail to resolve.
I think that structural perspective is exactly what MacIntyre offers, right?
Yeah, he is looking at the blueprint of modern morality and basically pointing out that the foundation was poured incorrectly about 300 years ago.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand MacIntyre's cure, we first have to thoroughly understand his diagnosis of the disease.
Right.
Why are we playing with mismatched game pieces? How did our moral vocabulary become a graveyard of disconnected fragments?
So to answer that, MacIntyre points us directly back to the Enlightenment. If we look at the 17th and 18th centuries, we see this incredible intellectual upheaval. You have philosophers like Immanuel Kant, David Hume, and later the utilitarians.
Right, the big names.
Yeah. And they looked at the world and they saw a Europe that had been torn apart by centuries of bloody religious wars.
Oh, right, because of the Reformation and all that.
Exactly. They looked at the older, classical, religiously grounded moral frameworks and decided those frameworks were just too volatile. Too sectarian.
Too much baggage.
Way too much baggage. So they attempted what was essentially a massive, unprecedented reconstruction project.
What did that look like?
Well, they wanted to keep the moral rules of the past. The basic guidelines like do not steal, tell the truth, keep your promises.
Which makes sense. You need those for society.
Right. But they wanted to completely strip away the older metaphysical, theological, and classical frameworks that originally gave those rules their authority.
Oh, wow.
They wanted a morality based on pure, secular, universal rationality.
I want to make sure I am really grasping the scale of what they were trying to do. It sounds like they wanted the fruits of the tree, but they wanted to chop down the roots and replace them with something completely synthetic.
That is a great way to put it.
But if they were using pure reason, shouldn't that have worked? I mean, mathematics is based on pure reason, and we all agree that 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah, you would think so.
Why couldn't they mathematically prove that lying is wrong?
It is a great question, and it is exactly what Kant tried to do with his categorical imperative. But the Enlightenment project failed because in chopping down those roots, they removed a foundational, non-negotiable concept,
And what was that?
a concept called teleology. That is a word that comes from Aristotle, and we really need to understand it deeply to understand anything else we talk about today.
Teleology. Break that down for me.
So in Greek, telos means an end, a goal, or a purpose. Teleology is the Aristotelian idea that everything in the natural world, including human beings, has a characteristic end or an inherent purpose.
Okay, so everything has a built-in goal.
Yes. In classical biology and metaphysics, you cannot understand what a thing is unless you understand what it is meant to become.
Can you give an example?
Sure. An acorn's telos is to become a mature oak tree. That is its purpose.
Okay, so if I buy a watch, the telos of that watch is to tell time accurately.
Precisely. And because the watch has a clear, objective purpose, we can make objective, factual statements about whether it is a good watch or a bad watch.
Because there's a standard to measure it against.
Exactly. If the watch loses an hour every day, it is a bad watch. Not because I personally dislike it, but because it is literally failing to achieve its telos.
That makes total sense.
And for centuries, classical morality operated on this exact same framework. Human beings were understood to have a specific telos, a highest good.
And what did Aristotle call that highest good?
He called it eudaimonia.
Let's hover on that word for a second. Eudaimonia. I have heard it translated as happiness, but that always felt a bit, I don't know, flimsy to me.
Yeah, it is a tough one to translate.
Like eating a whole pizza makes me happy. But I don't think that is what Aristotle meant.
You are right. Happiness is a pretty terrible translation for it. A much better way to think of eudaimonia is human flourishing.
Human flourishing. I like that better.
It is not a fleeting emotional state.
Mm.
Think of it like a finely tuned engine humming perfectly.
Okay.
It is the state of a human being functioning exactly as they were designed to function, realizing their ultimate potential.
And how does morality fit into that?
Well, in this classical framework, morality was simply the set of instructions, the virtues, that helped the human being transition from their untutored raw state to their realized purpose.
Oh, I see.
Morality was just the map to get to eudaimonia.
So teleology is the destination on the map. It is the fixed point. It is the why behind the what.
Exactly.
The rule "do not lie" isn't just some random command floating in the sky. It is a practical instruction because lying damages your character and prevents you from reaching eudaimonia.
Yes. The rules only made sense because everyone agreed on the destination. But then the scientific revolution happened.
Right. Galileo, Newton.
Yeah, the dawn of modern physics. Science began to look at the universe through a purely mechanistic lens. The universe was no longer seen as a purposeful organism.
What was it seen as?
It was seen as a giant blind machine. Science began to explain the world purely in terms of efficient causes.
Meaning what, exactly?
Like how things bump into each other, make things happen mechanically.
Yeah.
And it completely discarded the idea of final causes or inherent purposes.
I see where this is going. If the universe is just a machine and human beings are just biological machines made of atoms bumping into each other,
Right.
then there is no objective, scientifically verifiable purpose built into our biology.
Yes. The scientific worldview essentially outlawed teleology.
Yep.
And McIntyre argues that once you remove the concept of a human telos, morality loses its objective grounding entirely. You cannot derive an ought from an is. If a human being is just a collection of atoms, there is no scientific way to prove they ought to behave in a certain way.
We kept the driving directions: turn left at do not steal, turn right at be kind, but we completely wiped the destination off the map.
That is exactly what happened.
We have all these rules, but if someone asks, why should I follow them? The only answer the Enlightenment could give was to try and invent new, non-teleological reasons.
And look at what they invented. The utilitarians, like Hume and later John Stuart Mill, tried to base ethics on human sentiments.
Like calculating pleasure and pain.
Yes, calculating what brings the greatest pleasure and the least pain to the most people. Then Kant tried to base it on universal laws derived from abstract logic.
And then later we got natural rights, right?
Exactly. Later thinkers tried to invent legal fictions like natural rights. But McIntyre argues these are all doomed to fail from the start.
Why?
Because they were trying to use moral concepts that were originally shaped by a teleological worldview, but they were trying to use them inside a completely mechanistic, non-teleological universe.
It is like trying to run iOS software on a toaster.
Exactly. It doesn't work. The theories inevitably collapse into personal preference, cultural bias, or just ungrounded assumptions.
Let's ground this in reality, because this isn't just an abstract history lesson. This failure is why our modern debates are what McIntyre calls incommensurable.
Yeah, that is a heavy academic word.
Incommensurable, meaning there is no common standard of measurement between the opposing sides. The sources give us some incredibly stark examples of this. Let us look at the debate over what constitutes a just war.
Okay, yeah. The sources outline three distinct modern arguments regarding modern warfare. And when you look at them side by side, the incommensurability becomes totally obvious.
Walk me through them.
First, you have an argument rooted in classical pacifism or strict rule-based ethics. It argues that a just war must be able to cleanly distinguish between combatants and non-combatants.
Okay, makes sense.
But since modern warfare, with its drones, bombing campaigns, and massive collateral damage cannot make that distinction, all modern war involves the killing of innocents.
Therefore, all modern war is inherently unjust.
Right. That argument is relying on an absolute, non-negotiable moral rule. You cannot intentionally or predictably kill innocent non-combatants.
Okay, now what is the second argument?
The second argument is based entirely on survival and utilitarian deterrence.
Deterrence, like nuclear weapons.
Yes, it argues that to achieve the ultimate goal of peace and the preservation of our society, we must build up massive armaments and be fully prepared to go to the nuclear brink.
Because the threat of total destruction is the only thing that deters aggressive adversaries.
Exactly. Therefore, preparing for war and even engaging in proxy conflicts is justified to prevent a greater global catastrophe.
So that argument throws the absolute rule out the window. It relies entirely on pragmatic survival and a utilitarian calculation of outcomes.
Yep.
And what is the third?
The third argument shifts the focus to liberation and historical progress. It argues that while wars between great global powers are purely destructive and wrong,
Wars fought by oppressed groups are different.
yes, wars fought by oppressed groups to liberate themselves from tyranny or imperial control are inherently justified. Violence, in this view, is a necessary tool to destroy exploitation and achieve the collective happiness of marginalized people.
Now, put those three arguments in a room together. They aren't just disagreeing on the facts on the ground, they are disagreeing on the fundamental currency of the debate itself.
They really are.
The pacifist holds the trump card of absolute moral rules. The deterrence advocate holds the trump card of pragmatic survival. The liberation advocate holds the trump card of historical justice and the destruction of oppression.
Yeah.
If you are moderating that debate, how do you adjudicate between a strict moral rule, a pragmatic necessity, and a vision of liberation?
You can't. There is no shared scale to weigh a rule against an outcome. They're speaking completely different moral languages.
And the exact same structural breakdown happens in the debate over abortion, which the sources also map out for us.
Yes, that is another prime example.
Let's look at the mechanics of those arguments. One argument starts from the premise of individual bodily autonomy.
Right.
It states that a person has absolute, unassailable rights over their own physical body, and therefore forcing someone to carry a pregnancy against their will is a violation of that absolute right, making abortion permissible.
Right. And then you have a second argument that approaches the issue from a standpoint of strict philosophical consistency.
How does that one work?
This argument suggests that if you endorse a moral principle that would have justified your own abortion when you were a fetus, you are caught in a performative contradiction.
Oh, interesting.
So therefore, basic logical consistency requires you to affirm a general right to life for the unborn.
And then there's a third argument that combines biological definitions with absolute rules. It argues that an embryo is, biologically speaking, an individual member of the human species. It then pairs that biological fact with the absolute moral rule that taking innocent human life is always wrong, concluding that abortion is a moral prohibition.
Notice what is happening here. Just like the war example, we have completely incompatible premises.
Yeah, it is the same exact problem.
One side holds the supreme trump card of individual rights and bodily autonomy. Another side relies on abstract logical consistency. Another relies on biological definitions mixed with absolute divine or natural law.
When rights clash with absolute law, there is no umpire on the field to make a call.
None.
Because the umpire, a shared societal understanding of human teleology, a shared understanding of what a human being is actually for, was fired 300 years ago.
What is fascinating here is that this brings us to a really dark but brilliant historical realization.
Okay.
The sources point out that the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche saw this failure clearer than almost anyone else in the 19th century.
Really?
Yeah. Nietzsche looked at the Enlightenment thinkers with all their grand theories of utilitarianism, Kantian duty, and natural rights, and he basically laughed at them.
Why? What did Nietzsche see that they missed?
Nietzsche realized that because teleology was dead, all of these supposedly rational moral theories were actually just elaborate disguises. They were masks for what he called the will to power.
The will to power.
Yes. Since there is no objective human purpose to discover, any attempt to say you ought to do this is really just an individual or a group trying to impose their personal preferences on everyone else.
So when someone says you have a moral duty to do X,
Nietzsche translates that as, I want you to do X, and I am going to use this invented concept of duty to manipulate you into doing it.
wow. So Nietzsche just strips the veneer off the whole thing. He says, start pretending you have a universal rational system. You just want power.
Yeah.
You just want to win the game, and you are making up rules on the fly to ensure you get the monopoly money.
Exactly. And McIntyre says the real choice for moderns is this stark binary choice. You either accept Nietzsche's radical, cynical diagnosis that all morality is just a linguistic disguise for a raw power struggle, or you have to admit the Enlightenment was a mistake, go back to Aristotle, and find a way to rebuild teleology.
That is a heavy, heavy choice. We either surrender to Nietzsche's great man who just authorizes his own truth through sheer force of will, or we have to somehow resurrect the ideas of an ancient Greek philosopher in the 21st century.
That is the dilemma.
But let's say I don't want to live in Nietzsche's world of raw power. If the Enlightenment stripped away the framework that made moral rules make sense, how does the Aristotelian virtue tradition put it back together?
It is a big project.
Let's assume the listener is brand new to the concept of virtue ethics. How does McIntyre rebuild the compass?
McIntyre rebuilds it, but he doesn't just copy and paste Aristotle. He updates it for the modern world using three crucial interlocking puzzle pieces.
And what are those pieces?
Practices, narratives, and traditions. And it is important to stress that without all three working together, the system doesn't work. Let us start with the foundation. Puzzle piece number one, practices.
Okay, define a practice for me, because when I hear that word, I think of a doctor's medical practice or like football practice on a Tuesday afternoon.
McIntyre has a very specific, somewhat dense definition. He defines a practice as any coherent, complex, socially established, cooperative human activity.
Okay.
Through this activity, goods that are internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence.
Got it.
And through this, human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended.
Okay, let's translate that out of academic speak. A practice isn't just a simple habit like brushing your teeth or doing the dishes. Those are just chores.
Right.
A practice is something complex that has an established history and standards. It is an art form like painting, a science like physics, a complex game like chess, or even the sustaining of family life.
Exactly. And the most vital distinction McIntyre makes within a practice is the difference between internal goods and external goods. This is the key to understanding virtue.
Okay, let's break those down.
External goods are things like money, social status, prestige, power, or fame. They are called external because they are only contingently attached to the practice.
Meaning you can get them other ways?
Yes. You can acquire external goods in many different ways. You don't have to play chess to get money. You could inherit it, you could steal it, or you could invest in the stock market.
But internal goods are different. They are entirely unique to the practice itself. You cannot get them any other way.
Yes. The internal good of chess is the highly specific analytical skill, the appreciation for strategic beauty, and the profound, almost intuitive understanding of the game that you only achieve by fully dedicating yourself to the rules and history of chess.
You cannot buy that appreciation.
You cannot inherit that analytical skill. You have to submit to the practice to get it. And here is where McIntyre makes his masterstroke regarding virtue. He argues that virtues, qualities like honesty, courage, and justice, are absolutely necessary to achieve internal goods.
I think I need to test this with an analogy to make sure I really understand how virtue connects to a practice.
Go for it.
Let's say I enter a high-stakes international chess tournament. The prize is $1 million in global fame, but I am secretly wearing a tiny earpiece, and an AI on my phone is feeding me the statistically perfect moves.
Oh, sneaky.
I beat the grandmasters, I win the tournament, I get the $1 million in the trophy, I've successfully acquired the external goods. But what has my lack of virtue, my dishonesty cost me?
It has cost you the practice itself. By cheating, you have entirely locked yourself out of the internal goods of chess. You haven't expanded your human excellence.
Because I didn't actually play the game.
Exactly. You haven't developed your analytical mind. You haven't experienced the beauty of discovering a brilliant move. You have just tricked a system to get a paycheck. You are a millionaire, but as a chess player, you are impoverished.
That makes total sense. So, virtues aren't just arbitrary rules we follow to be good boys and girls. They are the required muscles you have to build to achieve excellence.
Yes.
If I don't have the virtue of patience, I can never learn to play the violin. If I don't have the virtue of justice, I can never sustain a functioning family.
Let's push your AI analogy even further because McIntyre's point goes beyond the individual. Think about the practice of scientific inquiry.
Okay.
The internal good of science is the discovery of truth about the natural world. If a scientist lacks the virtue of honesty and fabricates their data to get a lucrative government grant, an external good, they don't just fail to achieve the internal good for themselves.
It hurts everyone.
If that dishonesty becomes the norm, the entire practice of science collapses. If nobody trusts the data, science ceases to exist as a truth-seeking enterprise.
Yep.
It just becomes a bureaucratic machine for distributing grants. Virtues are what keep practices alive.
Wow. Okay, so I understand how virtues are formed inside a practice. You submit to the rules, you face the frustration of learning, and over time, it literally reshapes your character.
Right.
But I can't just be a good chess player or an honest scientist in a vacuum, right? Being a great chess player doesn't automatically mean I am a good father or a good citizen. That brings us to the second puzzle piece, the narrative unity of life.
Right. Actions aren't isolated, disconnected events. Modern society often conditions us to treat human life as a series of disjointed episodes. We compartmentalize.
Like you act one way at work and another way at home.
Exactly. You are a corporate worker from 9 to 5. You are a mindless consumer on the weekends. You are a partisan voter on election day. And you are a parent somewhere in between.
It's all chopped up.
But McIntyre argues that human actions only become intelligible. They only make sense when we view them as part of a continuous narrative. A human life has a narrative structure. It has a beginning, a middle, and a prospective end.
It is the difference between hearing a single, isolated note played on a piano and hearing that exact same note played within the context of a Beethoven sonata.
I love that analogy.
The single note is just a sound. It has no meaning. But inside the sonata, that note has meaning because of the melody that preceded it, the key signature it belongs to, and the musical resolution it is driving toward.
That is a beautiful way to explain it. Virtues only make sense within the context of an overarching life story striving toward certain purposes. McIntyre uses a great example. Imagine you see a man digging a hole in the ground.
Okay.
You ask him, why are you digging that hole? His physical action of digging only makes sense if he can contextualize it within a narrative. He might say, I am digging to build a foundation for a house so my family has shelter. Or he might say, I am digging to find buried treasure. The narrative gives the action meaning.
So, to be virtuous isn't just to be honest at work and brave at the gym. It is to cultivate the character traits that help you write a coherent, meaningful story of your entire life, integrating all those different practices into a unified vision of the good.
Yes.
If you divorce virtues from this narrative context, they become meaningless. Like, a hitman might need courage to carry out an assassination, but we wouldn't call him a virtuous person, because his overarching life narrative is aimed at destruction, not human flourishing.
Exactly. The narrative points the practices in the right direction. But there is one final piece. Because you and I are not just writing our life stories on a blank page while sitting on a deserted island.
We are born into stories that are already in progress.
Which leads us to the third puzzle piece, traditions.
Traditions. I have to admit, when I hear the word tradition, my modern individualistic brain rebels a little bit. We usually think of tradition as the thing that stocks arguments.
Yeah, totally.
We say, why do we do it this way? Because it is tradition. Stop asking questions.
And McIntyre completely redefines the concept to combat exactly that prejudice. He defines a tradition not as a static set of habits passed down unquestioningly.
What is it then?
He calls a tradition an historically extended, socially embodied argument. It is an ongoing, multi-generational debate about the very goods that constitute that tradition.
Wait, a tradition is an argument. That is totally counterintuitive. How can an argument be a tradition?
Think about it this way. A tradition that demands unquestioning obedience and never changes is a dead tradition. A living tradition persists precisely through critical debates and internal disagreements.
Oh, so it evolves.
It evolves. The hallmark of a strong, rational tradition is its ability to advance through honest debate, correcting its mistakes while preserving its core insights. You share enough common ground with your predecessors to have a meaningful argument with them.
Can you give me an example from the sources of a tradition doing this? Because I am still struggling to picture a tradition arguing with itself successfully.
The sources use Thomas Aquinas as the prime example of how a tradition evolves rationally. In the 13th century, the Christian theological tradition was facing a massive crisis.
What was happening?
The lost writings of Aristotle, a pagan Greek philosopher, were being rediscovered and translated into Latin. Aristotle's logic and science were incredibly compelling, but they seemed to contradict traditional Christian teachings.
So what did they do?
Some theologians panicked and tried to ban Aristotle.
The classics shut down the argument to protect the tradition move.
Exactly. But Aquinas didn't do that. Aquinas deeply critically engaged with Aristotle. He realized that the Christian tradition had a blind spot regarding the natural world, and that Aristotle had vital truths to offer.
But he didn't just accept everything Aristotle said.
Right. He also saw where Aristotle was wrong from a theological perspective. By arguing rigorously with both the Augustinian Christian tradition and the Aristotelian philosophical tradition, Aquinas synthesized them. He formed a Christian Aristotelianism. He allowed his tradition to evolve, to absorb new truths, and to respond rationally to a massive intellectual challenge without losing its core identity.
That is fascinating. He didn't abandon the ship, but he didn't refuse to upgrade the sails either. So what does this all mean?
It means morality isn't what the Enlightenment told us it was. It isn't just following a sterile list of universal rules in a vacuum.
Right. It is about submitting yourself to the discipline of a practice to build internal excellence. It is about integrating those practices into a coherent, unified life story. And it is about participating in a multi-generational living debate within a tradition.
That completely shifts the focus of our moral compass from asking, what are the rules I have to follow, to asking, what kind of person am I becoming?
And that shift is revolutionary. It puts the teleology back. But we have to acknowledge that this introduces a massive tension with how modern people think about morality.
Oh, a huge tension.
Because if true morality requires participating in shared traditions, mastering objective practices, and submitting to a shared understanding of human purpose, what happens to the modern obsession with the individual conscience?
Oh, this is where the rubber meets the road.
Because we live in a culture that absolutely worships the individual conscience. Think about the slogans we hear constantly. Follow your heart, speak your truth, let your conscience be your guide.
It is everywhere.
We treat the personal conscience like it is a magical oracle. If my conscience tells me something is right for me, then it is right. End of story. But the sources we have, particularly the writings of Cormac Burke and the theology of Aquinas, take a philosophical sledgehammer to this modern notion. Let us break down the misunderstood conscience.
To understand how far we have drifted, we have to look at the classical view of conscience, specifically the Thomistic view meaning from Thomas Aquinas.
Okay, what did he say?
In this framework, conscience is emphatically not an emotion. It is not a gut feeling. It is not a sudden burst of intuition. And it is most certainly not a creator of truth.
What is it then?
Aquinas defines conscience simply as practical reason applied to a specific situation. It is a cognitive, rational process where you take universal moral principles and apply them to a particular choice you have to make.
It is a truth-seeking faculty, not a truth-creating one.
Yeah.
I want to highlight that distinction because it is monumental. Truth-seeking versus truth-creating.
Yeah, it is a game changer.
Cormac Burke makes a profound theological point about the story of original sin with Adam and Eve to illustrate this exact danger. He argues that we usually misunderstand the story. We think the original sin was just breaking a petty arbitrary rule about eating an apple, like a cosmic parking ticket.
Right, but Burke argues that the temptation presented by the serpent wasn't just, hey, disobey God, it will be fun. The temptation was explicitly,
Yeah.
your eyes will be open and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.
And knowing means determining, right?
Yes. Burke explains that the phrase knowing good and evil in this context implies the power to determine it. The temptation was to manipulate truth, to become the architects of their own moral reality.
Oh.
The temptation was to be the creators of their own good and evil, rather than creatures submitting to an objective, uncreated truth.
So the original sin was the birth of the autonomous conscience.
Exactly, the autonomous conscious. The idea that my mind is the supreme legislator of reality, that I don't have to seek the truth, I just have to declare it.
But I have to push back here on behalf of the modern listener, because this sounds very rigid. Aren't we always told by almost every movie, book, and pop song to just follow your conscience?
We hear it all the time.
If I am facing a tough decision and I look deep inside myself and I sincerely believe in my heart that I'm doing the right thing, isn't sincerity enough? Doesn't my sincerity make the action moral for me?
The sources address this exact pushback head-on, and the classical answer is a resounding no. Sincerity is highly overrated as a moral standard.
Really, highly overrated.
Yes. A person can be completely 100% sincere and be completely tragically wrong. Sincerity does not equal truth. Sincerity is merely the psychological state of your conviction. It says absolutely nothing about the objective accuracy of your compass.
Burke gives a great cynical analogy for this. He says, imagine someone is sincerely trying to drive to a specific city. They want to get to Chicago. They take a road they sincerely believe goes to Chicago, but they are actually on the highway heading to St. Louis.
Right.
Their sincerity will not magically transport them to their destination. They will just end up lost, sincerely.
That analogy perfectly captures it. If conscience is a compass is only useful if it points to a magnetic north that exists outside of itself.
If I have a compass that doesn't point north but just points to whatever direction I want to walk in at any given moment, it isn't a compass.
It is a random number generator, and if you follow it, you will walk right off a cliff.
But why does our compass break? Why do we end up on the wrong road so often? This is where Burke gets into the psychology of self-deception, and it is uncomfortably accurate. He warns that the human will can actually plot against the mind.
This is a brilliant psychological insight. Let's say you are faced with a moral choice. Initially, your reason, your conscience, tells you clearly that a certain action is wrong.
Okay, give me an example.
For example, let's say you realize you have the opportunity to suddenly embezzle money from your company. Your conscience says this is theft, it is wrong. But your will deeply desires the external goods that action will bring. The money, the new car, the status.
The will wants the monopoly money.
Yes. And over time, if you don't discipline your will, it will begin to pressure your mind. It will demand that your intellect invent rationalizations.
It's like, well, the company underpays me anyway.
Exactly. You'll start thinking, I'm just taking what I deserve. Everyone else does it. It is not really stealing. It is an unofficial bonus. You selectively dwell only on arguments that justify the bad behavior. Eventually, you can bend and warp your conscience until it rubber stamps what your will had already decided to do.
You essentially bribe your own judge. You're becoming enslaved to your own bad will, all while walking around proudly claiming, I am just following my conscience. That is terrifyingly relatable. We rationalize our flaws all the time.
We absolutely do.
But this brings up a crucial distinction in Catholic moral theology that is mentioned in the sources. The difference between vincible ignorance and invincible ignorance. If my conscience is warped, am I responsible for that? What do those terms mean?
Let's start with invincible ignorance. This refers to a lack of moral knowledge that a person truly has no way of overcoming.
Okay.
Imagine someone born into a completely isolated, brutal society where certain horrific acts are universally taught as good. If that person genuinely had no access to the truth and no reasonable way to discover it given their circumstances, classical theology argues they are not morally culpable for the errors they make out of that ignorance.
It is invincible. It cannot be conquered by them.
Right. So God, or the moral universe, doesn't grade on an impossible curve. But what about the other kind? Vincible ignorance, on the other hand, is remediable ignorance. It's an ignorance that you could dispel and that you ought to dispel, but you willfully avoid doing so. It is an ignorance born of negligence or deliberate avoidance.
Oh, let's apply this directly to the modern digital age. Think about your own habits right now. We live in an era with more instant access to information than any generation in human history. We carry libraries in our pocket.
Yeah, we have everything at our fingertips.
Yet, paradoxically, we increasingly live in heavily fortified information silos, filter bubbles, and echo chambers. We curate our social media feed so we only hear opinions that flatter our existing worldview.
It is so true.
When an article or a piece of data pops up that challenges our politics or suggests our lifestyle might be harmful, what do? We swipe past it, we block the user, we mute the channel, we avoid the facts because confronting them would be intellectually uncomfortable and might demand that we change our behavior.
And that deliberate avoidance, according to the sources, is the textbook definition of vincible ignorance. Willfully remaining in an echo chamber is not a valid excuse for a malformed conscience.
It actually makes it worse.
It actually increases your moral culpability. When you refuse to seek the truth because you suspect the truth might be inconvenient, your ignorance isn't innocent. It is a deliberate, cowardly strategy of the will to avoid moral responsibility.
So, treating your conscience as an infallible, truth-creating oracle while simultaneously hiding in a digital echo chamber of vincible ignorance is essentially a recipe for individual moral disaster. You are driving with a broken compass and refusing to look out the windshield.
It really is a disaster.
But let's scale this up. We have been talking about the individual. What happens when you put millions of these individuals into a society? If a nation is made up of millions of people, all relying on their autonomous, subjective, truth-creating consciences, and none of them share a teleological goal, how does that society ever agree on what is just? How do we write laws?
The short, brutal answer is it can't. When individual moral fragmentation scales up to the macro-societal level, the entire concept of justice shatters into competing interest groups.
How does that play out?
To illustrate exactly how this macro failure happens, the sources dive into the massive philosophical clash between two titans of 20th century political theory, John Rawls and Robert Nozick. Both of these men represent different flavors of modern liberal individualism.
Okay.
And their debate perfectly encapsulates why our macropolitics are so paralyzed.
Okay, let's break down the fighters in this philosophical heavyweight match. These two theories basically form the bedrock of the modern political left and right. Let's start with the left. In one corner, we have John Rawls, representing justice as fair distribution. What is his core argument, and how does he get there?
Rawls was trying to figure out how to design a just society among people who disagree on everything. So he asks us to imagine a brilliant thought experiment called the veil of ignorance, or the original position.
Let's actually do the thought experiment. Put me in the veil. How does it work?
Okay, you are tasked with writing the Constitution, the tax codes, and the laws for a brand new society. But you have to write them from behind the veil of ignorance. This means you have a temporary amnesia.
So I don't know who I am.
Yeah, exactly. You do not know what position you will hold in this new society. You don't know your race, your gender, your physical health, your intelligence, or your natural talents. You don't know if you will be born the child of a tech billionaire in a mansion, or if you will be born with a severe physical disability to a single mother living in poverty.
Okay, that changes the math completely, because if I know I'm going to be a billionaire, I'd write laws with zero taxes and no social safety net. But since I don't know, I have to hedge my bets.
Right.
I have to design a society that I would be okay living in even if I end up at the absolute bottom of the ladder.
Precisely. Rawls argues that any rational, self-interested person behind this veil of ignorance would inevitably design a society that prioritizes two main principles. First, an equal liberty principle, which maximizes basic political and civil freedoms for everyone.
Okay, and the second?
The second, and most importantly for economics, you would establish the difference principle. This principle states that social and economic inequalities are only permissible if they are arranged to benefit the least advantaged members of society.
So doctors can make more money than fast food workers, but only if paying doctors more ensures we have a medical system that provides better care for the poorest person in the society.
Exactly.
If an inequality doesn't lift the bottom, it is unjust. Justice, for Rawls, is defined by addressing needs and ensuring fair distribution. It sounds incredibly compassionate and rational on paper.
It is deeply influential. But now let's bring in the challenger in the other corner, Robert Nozick, representing justice as entitlement. Nozick looks at Rawls' difference principle and says that is fundamentally unjust.
Why? What is his counterpunch? How can it be unjust to help the poorest?
Because Nozick grounds justice entirely in individual historical rights and property. He proposes an entitlement theory of justice. He argues that a distribution of wealth across a society is just if and only if everyone is entitled to the things they currently possess.
And how do you become legitimately entitled to something?
In two ways. First, just initial acquisition, meaning you mixed your labor with unknown resources, you found an empty plot of land, you farmed it, it is yours.
Okay. In the second way.
Second, just transfer, meaning it was transferred to you voluntarily by someone else who had the legitimate right to it through a gift, an inheritance, or a free market trade.
So if I buy a car from you and neither of us lied or used force, that is a just transfer. The outcome is just, regardless of whether I am rich and you are poor.
Exactly. Nozick vehemently opposes Rawls's idea of continuously redistributing wealth to help the least advantaged. Why? Because wealth doesn't just fall from the sky into a central pot waiting to be distributed by bureaucrats.
It is created.
And wealth is created by individuals. To achieve Rawls's fair distribution, the government must constantly step in and take legitimately acquired property from individuals via taxation without their consent. For Nozick, taxation to fund a welfare state is akin to forced labor. Justice is defined strictly by legitimate acquisition and voluntary exchange.
Let me make sure I see the collision here. Here is where it gets really interesting. Let's imagine a society where one entrepreneur creates a brilliant software company, people voluntarily buy his product, and he becomes a billionaire. Meanwhile, across town, a factory worker loses his job due to automation and falls into poverty.
Right, a common scenario.
Rawls looks at that society and says, this is unjust. We must tax the billionaire to provide a safety net for the worker, because behind the veil of ignorance, that is what we would have agreed to.
But Nozick looks at the exact same society and says this is perfectly just. The billionaire acquired his wealth through voluntary trades. The worker's poverty is unfortunate, but taking the billionaire's property by force to fix it is a violation of his fundamental rights. That is the exact debate. And McIntyre steps into the ring, looks at both Rawls and Nozick, and delivers his devastating critique. He says, this debate is essentially unresolvable. It will go on forever.
Why? Why can't we find a middle ground?
Because just like the debates over abortion and war, Rawls and Nozick are using completely incommensurable premises. They're playing different games. Rawls treats urgent human need and hypothetical fairness as the ultimate trump card. Nozick treats legitimate historical ownership and property rights as the ultimate trump card.
And there's no way to compare them.
Our pluralist modern culture has absolutely no rational criterion, no shared scale, to weigh a claim of urgent need against a claim of legitimate entitlement. How many units of need justify overriding one unit of property rights? It is an impossible equation.
So we just vote. And whoever has 51% of the power gets to enforce their premise for 4 years until the other side wins and flips it back. It is just Nietzsche's will to power disguised as macroeconomics.
Exactly. But McIntyre points out something even more profound about this debate. He identifies the massive, glaring missing element in both of their theories. Both Rawls and Nozick, despite being opposites, completely leave out the classical Aristotelian concept of desert, spelled D-E-S-E-R-T.
Moral desert. The idea of what a person actually deserves based on their character.
Yes. In the classical virtue tradition, justice was inexorably tied to merit, virtue, and character. Justice meant giving each person what they deserve based on their virtues and their tangible contributions to the common good of the community. But modern liberal theory explicitly, purposely rejects the idea of desert.
Why? Why would both sides abandon the idea that people should get what they deserve?
Rawls literally argues in his work that you cannot base justice on moral desert because, in a pluralistic society, we can't agree on what is virtuous. He says our natural talents, our work ethic, and even our good character are largely the result of a genetic lottery and a good upbringing, which we didn't earn. Therefore, we don't truly deserve the rewards they bring.
And Nozick.
Nozick ignores moral desert for a different reason. He only cares about procedural history. He only cares if the legal paperwork for the property transfer is valid. He doesn't care if the billionaire is a greedy, miserable miser, or if the poor worker is the most generous, virtuous man in town. Virtue is irrelevant to rights.
It seems like they both had to abandon desert because, as we established in the very beginning, society abandoned teleology. You can't judge if someone deserves something based on their virtue if society has no shared definition of the human good.
Right.
Liberal individualism views society merely as an arena of strangers. It pictures society as a collection of isolated, autonomous individuals, each pursuing their own private preferences, who only interact to trade goods or to avoid harming each other.
That is the core tragedy. If society is just an arena of strangers, justice is reduced to a bureaucratic procedure. It is completely severed from moral worth. It is just managing competing interests without any shared moral vision.
Which brings us to the ultimate pressing question for you, the listener. We have mapped out the disease. We see that our macro politics, the way our massive nation states govern, is entirely hollow at its core. It is structurally incapable of resolving these moral conflicts or fostering true virtue. So what is the practical takeaway? Do we just throw our hands up in despair? How do we find true north and live morally today?
McIntyre's conclusions here are undeniably radical. He argues that modern systematic macro-politics is essentially just a managed continuation of civil war. Because the government no longer represents a coherent moral community, it is just a neutral referee managing the arena of strangers. Patriotism itself, in the classical sense of loyalty to the moral project of the state, loses its meaning as a virtue.
That is a heavy statement.
The modern nation-state is just a massive administrative apparatus imposing unity on a fractured populace. Therefore, McIntyre argues, trying to rebuild moral life primarily through national elections, capturing the presidency, or passing sweeping federal laws is a fool's errand. It is trying to fix the plumbing of a house that is built on quicksand.
I have to admit that sounds almost defeatist. It sounds like he is saying, give up on the country, the system is rigged. What is his actual proposal? If we don't fix it from the top down, what do we do?
McIntyre draws a profound historical analogy to answer that. At the very end of After Virtue, he points to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. As the empire slowly collapsed into moral exhaustion, political corruption, and social confusion, men and women of goodwill stopped trying to prop up the imperial structures in Rome.
They just walked away.
They realized the empire couldn't be saved by another emperor or another law. Instead, figures like St. Benedict stepped back. They withdrew from the macro politics and formed new, small, intentional local communities, which became the monastic movement.
The monastery.
Yes. And during the ensuing Dark Ages, it was those small, isolated monasteries that became the arcs of civilization. They preserved literacy, they preserved education, they preserved civility, and most importantly, they preserved moral life and the virtues while the broader society fractured. McIntyre argues that modern people are in a similar historical moment. We must do the same. We need what is often called a new monasticism.
A new monasticism. I want to be very practical here for the listener. Because when people hear monasticism, they picture shaving their heads, putting on coarse brown robes, taking a vow of silence, and moving to a compound in the desert to avoid the world. Is McIntyre telling us to literally drop off the grid and form isolationist cults?
Not literally, no. He is not advocating for running away from reality. The practical application of the new monasticism is a radical shift in your focus, your energy, and your moral imagination. It means intentionally turning your gaze away from the intoxicating spectacle of national politics, the endless outrage cycle of cable news, and the illusion that we can legislate virtue from the Capitol.
So what do we turn towards?
You must invest deeply, almost exclusively, in small, intentional, local forms of community.
So we are talking about getting intensely involved in a local school board, a neighborhood association, a dedicated religious congregation, a tight-knit extended family structure, or even a highly committed professional guild.
Exactly. Why local? Because it is only in these local face-to-face communities that the practices we defined earlier can actually be sustained. You cannot have a practice with a million strangers. It is only at the grassroots level that we can look each other in the eye and hold each other accountable to internal standards of excellence.
That makes a lot of sense.
It is only in local communities that we can engage in the shared historical argument of a living tradition without it turning into a polarized shouting match.
And most importantly, it seems like a close-knit community is the only place where true character education happens. If my conscience is warped and I am blinded by vincible ignorance, reading a tweet from a stranger won't fix me. But a friend in my community, someone who knows my narrative, can sit me down, point out my self-deception, and help me align my conscience with objective truth.
That is the crux of it. In a genuine local community, you aren't just an anonymous stranger bumping into other strangers in a liberal arena. You are a known entity. Your life narrative is intimately intertwined with the narratives of your neighbors. And because of that, you can actually practice moral desert again. You can recognize and reward virtue and discourage vice because your small community actually shares a common understanding of what a good human life looks like.
You rebuild the teleology on a microscale. You say, as a nation, we might be lost, but here in this neighborhood, in this congregation, we agree on what human flourishing looks like, and we are going to help each other achieve it.
If we pull all the way back and connect this to the bigger picture, building these local, intentional communities is how we escape the Nietzschean trap of sheer individualism and will to power and return to authentic human flourishing. If we remain isolated individuals staring at our screens, relying entirely on our autonomous truth-creating consciences while living in a massive bureaucratic state, we will inevitably succumb to the will to power. We will just keep shouting our preferences at each other in the ruins of the game board.
But by returning to local communities bound by shared practices, compelling narratives, and living traditions, we can cultivate the virtues necessary to survive the coming dark ages. We can return to authentic human flourishing.
That is the goal.
This has been an absolutely massive paradigm-shifting journey today. Let's do a quick recap to tie all these complex threads together for you, the listener. We started by diagnosing the modern moral mashup. We saw how the Enlightenment stripped away our shared human purpose, our teleology, leaving us holding on to moral rules that no longer make structural sense, resulting in endless, incommensurable debates over things like war and rights.
To fix this foundational error, we explored MacIntyre's Aristotelian antidote. We saw that we must ground our moral lives in cooperative practices that build internal excellence, recognize the narrative unity of our lives, and participate in the evolving arguments of living traditions.
We then confronted the deep psychological danger of the modern autonomous conscience. We learned from Aquinas and Burke that treating our conscience as a truth creator rather than a truth seeker is the original temptation. And we recognize the urgent need to fight against our own invincible ignorance, especially in an age of digital echo chambers where we willfully avoid inconvenient truths.
We then scale that problem up to see how individual fragmentation ruins societal justice. We walk through the unresolvable debate between Rawls' fairness and Nozick's entitlement, realizing that both theories fail because they exclude the classical concept of moral desert, what people actually deserve based on their virtues, because they view society merely as an arena of strangers.
And finally, we arrived at the ultimate call to action, the new monasticism. The call to stop waiting for macro politics to save us and to start building intentional local communities where true virtue can actually survive. You have agency right now. You can evaluate the practices you dedicate your time to. You can brutally examine your own echo chambers and root out your vincible ignorance. And you can seek out and invest in local communities that share a vision of the good.
It is a profound, demanding challenge. It asks us to fundamentally rethink not just how we argue about politics, but how we live our daily lives.
Which brings me to a final lingering thought for you to mull over until our next deep dive. It is a thought directly inspired by the collision of these ancient classical sources with our current technological trajectory. We are currently racing as a species to build artificial intelligence. And as we build these massive neural networks, we are frantically trying to program them with ethics and alignment. We want them to make moral choices. We want to teach them the rules of the game. But if the sources we discussed today are right, if true morality is not just a math equation or a list of utilitarian rules, if it actually requires a human life with a physical, temporal narrative arc embedded in an ongoing, multi-generational human tradition and guided by a spiritual conscience that witnesses objective truth rather than just calculating procedural logic, can an AI ever actually be ethical? Or are we just building the ultimate fragmented autonomous machine, a purely procedural entity completely devoid of teleology, incapable of moral desert, and lacking a truth-seeking soul? If an AI cannot experience the physical frustration of a practice, and if it cannot have a narrative unity of life, can it ever possess a virtue? Think back to those game pieces scattered in the dirt of the ruined city. A chess knight, a pair of dice, Monopoly money. We are desperately trying to teach a machine how to play a game that we ourselves have forgotten the rules to. Something for you to think about until our next deep dive.